All right, y'all. I am so just honored and excited. And I just know that you all are going to be so blessed by the different sessions that we have planned as we start talking about embracing your role of leadership. And what does that look like in the context of you caring for your own soul? And the women that we're going to be talking about as a part of this conversation, they have leadership roles themselves. And there are certain elements of being a leader that I think is very foundational that you need to know about how to care for your own soul. And I think that a lot of that starts with loving yourself, self love. Now, I don't know about you and what your relationship is with hearing the word self love, because I know that we live in a culture that is always sometimes makes us feel like it's all about us and everything is about us. And we know that there is an element of that that is true, that there is care and attention that we need to give to ourselves. But how do we do that in a way that feels authentic? How do we do that in a way that it is not us excluding the people in our lives because we have put all of our focus on ourselves? What does that actually look like? What does it mean to love yourself? And when I was thinking about how can we talk about this and who should we talk to about this, the person that came to mind is my guest today. And my guest is April. And April she has so many layers to her that I cannot wait for you to get to meet her and hear more even about her story and what's happening in her life. But I thought she was the perfect person for us to talk to about this today, especially because of the type of work that she does. So, April, I just want to say thank you for being a part of this conversation, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Kendra. I am definitely honored to be here. You know that I am one of the biggest fans of the work that you do to support women in leadership. And so it's an honor. Thank you.
Yeah, what were you thinking as you hear me talk about self-love? Do you yourself have any, or did you have any misconceptions about what self-love is?
Yes. So, you started out by saying that, self love is this word, this term. Sometimes I think we hear more and more. I would say the last few years, we'll hear it more and more,
Mhm,
right? We hear it a
mhm,
lot of
mhm,
times coupled with self care, there's self love, soul care, things like that. And so when I think about self love, it was something that, to be honest with you, I never paid attention to until probably the last 5 or 6 years of my life. And when I started to do the work that I do, because self love to me, it sounded very selfish, self centered, right? It was like, you're only thinking about yourself, it's all about me. But when I took the time to understand what self love really was, it
mhm,
was such an eye opener. And so when someone would ask me, well, what do you think self love is? The simplest way I can describe it is not sacrificing your well being to please someone else. And it's also giving yourself permission to explore and express your authentic self. That is like the most simplest way, right? So it's not the lack of supporting people, it's not the lack of uplifting people, but when we get to that place where we're sacrificing our well-being, just think
mm.
about that. Sacrificing our well-being. That is when we start to stray away from that self-love.
Yeah, when you talk about us sacrificing ourselves, that to me, that resonates. And because I think there is like a nobility that we feel in us always putting other people ahead of ourselves and putting their needs ahead of our needs. And in some ways, I think it might even feel natural, especially for those of us that do any type of caregiving, like whether you are a parent or maybe you're caring for an aging parent or you're caring for a family member or a spouse or a friend, someone in your life. I think that you learn maybe from even observing other people, that what you should be doing is sacrificing yourself in the process. And I feel like what you're explaining is that that's not true. That what would you say instead of sacrificing yourself? What should you be doing instead? Like if you are the person that is watching this, and all the women that we're talking to are women who are in helping professions, and what does it look like to not sacrifice ourselves?
Yeah. What you said just resonates, Kendra, because when we think about helping, and
Mhm,
so, what we're talking about today is women who are in those helping roles. And that could be, a mom, caregiver, like you said.
mhm,
When you think about the word help, a lot of times we equate that with serve, which serving is a part of helping someone else. And I think that there has been this misconception that true servanthood means there's nothing left for you. And so I'm going to just bring up the life of Jesus.
mhm, mhm,
As much as he served, we still found him taking a nap. We
mhm,
still found him like, I'm going to go off by myself and pray. We still found him telling the disciples, you need to go rest up for this journey ahead of you, right? And so when I think about servanthood, it is serving with balance. So it is serving versus sacrificing, right? Serving with balance. It is serving those that need you, but taking the essential time to refuel, and we refill who you are so that you can continue to serve.
mhm. And even you changing the wording of that to servanthood versus sacrifice. And yeah, and Jesus to me is the perfect example, of course, of what it actually means. And if we pay attention to his life and the things that you've already mentioned about the way that he went about serving, didn't mean that he was willing to sacrifice his own peace even in the process. That's why there's so many scriptures about him going away by himself, away from everybody else, right? All right, away from the crowd, away from the noise, getting away so that he could have that time that he needed to refill himself. And we are calling our wellness retreat, we're calling it recharge. And it's like the battery, right? The battery that starts to drain. And we can see that on our phones. It tells us when our battery is getting low. And so what we want women to understand is that them learning that through their servanthood, there are going to be times where they have to be very intentional about how do you recharge yourself. And I think your expertise and your experience and wisdom around self-love is one of the tools that we're going to hand them for them to be able to do that. So, can you describe a time for us during your leadership journey where practicing self-love made a significant difference for you in terms of not only your effectiveness, but just even your confidence?
Absolutely. So my professional career has lived in two spaces mostly. So one was in kind of a tech industry, and I was in leadership there for many years. And then the other one has been more in a faith-based organization, life coaching, some more of that servanthood, right?
Mhm,
But also being an executive and a leader in those arenas as well. And one of the areas that I had to um, implement for self love is in
mhm,
the area of setting boundaries. That is one, I know we hear that term a lot, boundaries. Boundaries are here to keep us safe. And so, what I had to ask myself was, am I loving my career path? Am I loving my title? Am I loving the things that come with leadership more than I'm loving myself?
mhm,
And for a period of time, that answer was yes, right? A lot of times as leaders, we are climbing the corporate ladder. There are things we want to do as a leader, but along the way, our self gets left behind. And so for me, it was going back and setting boundaries. And those boundaries could have been as simple as I'm not going to answer emails at a certain time. I am not going to answer phone calls at a certain time. When it is time for my family, that will be family time. When it's time for work, that will be work time. So a lot of it was around setting boundaries around my time. And one of the things that I realized was, or that hit me one day was, look, you can always make more money. You will never get more time, ever. And so I had to ask myself, what am I doing with my time that is going to last? And I was burnt out as a leader. And
Mhm.
so that was probably the biggest area of self-love that I went back and implemented was boundaries on my time.
Yes, yeah. And that is a topic as I'm talking to the different people for this wellness retreat. It just keeps coming up over and over again. What do you think the connection is between boundaries and self-love?
Like I mentioned before, boundaries keep us safe.
Hmm.
And going back to my definition of sacrificing our well-being. So those boundaries are what help us to keep our well-being safe.
Hmm.
And so when I think about well-being and we think about our lack of boundaries with time, this is what causes stress.
Hmm.
It can cause anxiety,
Hmm.
depression.
Hmm. Hmm.
And we know that scientifically, these manifest as physical things in our body.
Hmm.
And so when
Hmm.
I think about, that lack of time boundaries, that lack of self-love, now we're looking at these different ailments. And so once again, we're going back to what? It's our well-being.
Yeah.
And I think when we think about well-being, it's like, do I exercise enough? Do I eat right? And all those things are good. But one of the biggest contributors to a poor physical body, mental body, emotional body is stress.
Hmm.
A lot of stress comes from lack of time boundaries.
Yes. Yep. It all comes back around to that, doesn't it? It
Yeah,
just comes right back around to that. So, what are some self-love practices that you find particularly powerful in terms of your leadership ability? So if I'm leading a team, or I don't even have to be leading a team in the work that I do, I just need to show a level of leadership in my work. But I also want to make sure that I'm taking care of my well-being that you are talking about. So, what are some practices that you would recommend to your clients or the people that you work with?
absolutely. The first one is self-compassion.
Mhm.
I believe that women, particularly, and women in leadership, we are just so hard on ourselves.
Mhm.
And part of that comes from the leadership environments that we may have been in. If you've been maybe the only woman in leadership or the only woman of color in leadership, I feel like that there is almost this pressure to be perfect, right? And so, what I believe that we do, we internalize some of our faults, weaknesses, whatever you want to call it, and that diminishes our self compassion for ourselves. So, number one, I would say give yourself some grace, right?
Mhm.
Second thing is our self talk.
Mhm.
This is an area that really guides a lot of our life.
Mhm.
And the way that we talk to ourselves, the way that we talk about ourselves. I've seen women in leadership in different organizations that will diminish themselves with their words
Mhm.
because of maybe a background level of education. So our self-talk is so huge in shaping, that self-love as a leader. And then the other thing I think about is personal growth. This is an area where we have to focus on no matter how far we go in leadership, right? Personal growth is one of the things that I believe will give us confidence to be a better leader. When we are ignorant in an area, it when we don't understand or ignorant in an area, it shows in our leadership. And so these may be things like how to have, impactful conversations, how to be authentic. And so constantly growing as a leader, I think will add to that self-love in leadership.
Yes, absolutely. The growth. That's actually something. I'm glad you brought that up because that's actually not something I hear many people um talking about is the personal growth that you need as a leader, because it's easy to become stagnant and it's easy for us to look at the things that we're doing, the thoughts that we're having, and never really being willing to do anything different. Like we know there's a problem, we know there's something that we want to be different, but we're not going to take any action for it to actually be different. Right. And especially depending on the environment that you've been in before, like maybe you were the only person it seemed like around you who was actually trying to grow, who was trying to do something different. Maybe you started going to therapy, or maybe you started reading your Bible more, or you did something that where you wanted to change, but everybody else was staying the same. So it kind of felt like, well, what am I doing all of this for?
Yep,
Is that,
exactly.
can you relate to that?
Absolutely. And almost to a degree of growing yourself out of your position, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, we hear people talk about, I want to go to the next level. I want to be promoted. I want bigger opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
but it's doing the work behind that of personal growth. And that may be taking a class. As I was on my journey to first become a business coach and then transforming business coaching into life coaching, that was something that I had to grow in. I had been coaching people, for 8 years before I moved into life coaching. But what gave me the confidence to coach women in this area was I got a life coaching certification. I read books, I attended classes, I did
Mm-hmm.
the things that allowed me to grow personally, but it also allowed me to grow, not as a coach, but as a person. So now when I coach women in these areas of healing from heartbreak, of recovering from divorce, of bouncing back from death of a significant other, dating, in a healthy way, it gave me the confidence to lead them in those areas because of the journey of personal growth I went on before doing that work.
Thank you. That was just a really good practical example of that. And I wanted to read something when you talked about self-compassion. This is something that I'm learning more and more about. So last year I read Rising Strong by Brene Brown, which I really highly recommend that book. And there's a quote that I pulled out of the book because it resonated with me so much. It said, compassionate people ask for what they need. They say no when they need to. And when they say yes, they mean it. They're compassionate because their boundaries keep them out of resentment. I said yes when I wanted to say no. I put no value on my work or my needs. In turn, they, whoever they is, put no value on my work or my needs either. So I was thinking, man, when you talked about self-compassion, I was like, that's so good. It literally made me think about that quote, because part of compassion is being willing to be honest about what your actual needs are. And I often wonder, if we were more compassionate with ourselves, would it make it easier for us to be compassionate with the people that we work with?
I believe that's true.
Mhm.
And when I think about someone in leadership, leadership is a team sport, or it should be. Good
Mhm.
leadership is a team sport.
Yes, yes.
So you may be leading a team, but you also need the support of that team,
Mhm.
which means being a leader that knows themselves enough to say, this is what I need from my team, and being willing to ask for it without feeling like my team is going to look at me a certain way. They're not going to respect me, right?
Mhm.
But to your point, being able to ask your team for what you need as a leader and vice versa. But that is, I think, where that self compassion comes in.
Yeah. And then the third thing that you talked about was self-talk. And that's actually come up in another session, is around the self-talk. So you stated that this is a self-love practice that you think would enhance our leadership abilities. Can you think of a moment or an experience that you had where you could tell the difference between if you had the right self-talk, things went one way, but if you would have had negative self-talk, they would have gone in a different direction.
Absolutely. The first thing that comes to mind is I was going for a promotion in a job. This was probably 10 years ago or
Mhm.
so. Um, and I was not on paper qualified. Okay.
Mhm.
I didn't have
Mhm.
a degree in this area, but I had gone through a journey of personal growth. So I had studied this area. I had put into practice the things that I studied, but I knew that the people that I was competing against on paper probably looked a whole lot better than I did. And so one of the practices that I do with self-talk is I will write out certain things and either put them on sticky notes. I will write them out on my mirror in the bathroom with like a dry erase marker, and I speak them.
Mhm.
And I would started to just speak over myself that this was the perfect opportunity for me, that I was prepared for this opportunity, that I had studied. So those things that I believe, we see what we say. So the things that you are speaking is what you're going to say. It is going to set your expectation. It's what you're going to see. It's going to set your expectation for what you see. And so throughout that, the kind of interview trial process, I just kept telling myself, I've studied for this. I've prepared for this. I made for this role, all these different things. And so in my interviews, I was very confident in my ability to fulfill that next position, even though on paper I didn't have the degree, I didn't have some of the experience. And I believe that is what set me apart versus someone maybe walking into that interview with like, oh, okay, I've got the degree, I've got this, I know I've got it. And so I believe that that shift in my talking to myself is what shifted my confidence when I spoke in an interview.
Mhm.
Whether that was for a CFO or CMO or whoever it was, I believe that that initial internal boost through my self-talk at home is what gave me the confidence to talk, with confidence within that interview. Now, I could imagine had I let the fear of and the voice of, you're not qualified, you don't have a degree, you haven't been in this field long enough, those things sink in, or if that's what I spoke, that would have come out in the interview process.
Mhm.
And so because of that, I ended up getting that job where literally it should not have been mine. But I do believe that building myself up with that self-talk helped me to go through that interview process with confidence, even with full knowledge that these people, other people on paper, were probably better qualified.
So self-compassion, self-talk, and personal growth are three self-care practices that you think will enhance our leadership abilities. And I agree with you 100%. Just like your smartphone needs regular charging, so do you. Without regular recharging, your energy and spirit can run out, leaving you feeling drained and ineffective. Join the Strong Her Leadership Coaching Cohort to build soul care habits that prioritize your well being. Nurture your inner self, not just to care for others, but to sustain your own health and happiness. Strengthen your capacity to lead with confidence and resilience. Prioritize yourself and see the difference it makes in your life and leadership. Learn more at strongher.me/leadership cohort. Well, let's talk a little bit about the challenges of prioritizing self-love while you're also fulfilling your leadership responsibilities. So, what have you experienced as a challenge, and then how did you overcome the challenge?
One of the things that, in hindsight 2020, one
Yep,
of
of
the
course.
things that I did not realize I was doing before I started to explore and practice self love was I was leading from a lack of authenticity.
Mm,
And so in our leadership, I believe that it should be authentic. We should be able to be our authentic selves. That is when we bloom and blossom as leaders. But when we don't have the self love that I believe we should have, we diminish ourselves. And so one of the areas was I was not my authentic self. I was this kind of one person at work. one person at home. I could be myself here. I can't really be myself there. And so I believe that that caused a rift between my team. And what happened was I started to hear things like, I don't think April trusts us, or I don't think April believes in us. And that is because I wasn't allowing myself to be authentic with who I was to show them that, like, hey, I trust you, I believe in you as a key, as a team. It was very kind of robotic. And so that was one of the areas for me, was allowing myself to be authentic in my leadership roles.
What that is such a interesting thought. And the reason why I find it so interesting because I also find it very relatable. Tell me, what did it look like for you? What do you mean when you say that you weren't being your authentic self? What does that mean?
In some instances, it may have been I did not maybe share a personal experience that would help my team,
Mm.
right? I did not let them get to know April. And so it may have been when your team had an issue, me saying, oh, you know what? I went through that at another job versus, okay, here's a solution. So when I think about authenticity, I think about putting a human spin on your leadership. And that
Mhm.
is because for me, in many of my leadership roles, I was the only woman and I saw certain behaviors from male leaders. And so I thought to myself, or I would hear things like, as a woman, you can't be too compassionate. You can't be too soft. You can't be too this. And I wanted to be those things for my team, but I would think that back to myself, well, you're a leader. You can't be this. You can't show emotion. You can't, all these different things. And so when I decided to lead from my authentic self, which was, I'm going to show you compassion, I'm going to check in on you, I'm going to maybe help understand your situation as a subordinate, that is when I feel like my leadership style shifted. And that is when my relationship with those that reported to me shifted. But a
Mhm.
lot of it came from this perception of who a leader is supposed to be,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Does that
Yeah.
help? That makes sense?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The I just think that the women that are going to watch this, exactly what you shared, sometimes you don't even know what to call something until you hear someone else point it out. And I think hearing you say that you weren't being your authentic self, and then you also giving an example of what you mean, I think that's going to resonate with women because when you are in a leadership position, there is the needs that you have, but then you also have all the needs from all these people that you're leading. And I think that sometimes we think that to minimize the pressure or stress of that, let's just go in here. I'm going to put on a mask and let me just get this work done. Right. And we think we can like leave who we really are at home. And maybe they've even been in an environment where it was almost expected, like I'm a robot, like I'm here, but I'm not a human being too. Right. And so that's why I wanted you to share a little bit more for us about that, because I know that that's going to be something that really resonates with women. So
Yeah, I'll give you another example, Kendra, of the job that I had where I decided to be my authentic self, because it's a decision.
yes.
And part of that, I think, comes with being a woman of color.
Hmm.
We live in Arizona. And so a lot of the organizations that we're going to work for and be around, you may be the only chocolate chip in the cookie.
Yes.
And so for many years, you're kind of taught to want to wear your hair a certain way, don't say certain things, don't. And so I had joined an organization about 15 years ago or so, and it was the most diverse team I'd ever been on. And so there was people of different, probably 4 or 5 different racial backgrounds. There were people who were different sexual orientations. There were probably 3 or 4 different religious beliefs on the team. But one of the things that our supervisor gave us the ability to do was to be our authentic self. And so it was myself and another lady who were Christians on the team. And
Mhm.
so we could be open about that, right? We didn't, be people with the Bible or anything like that, but we could be open
Yes.
about who we are, as well as the other people who had different religious preferences.
Mhm.
And so I remember we got to this point on the team where there was like this big project coming up, and we were in a meeting, and someone was like, April, look, I need you to pray for this project because, and it was probably the best team we ever worked on. And
Mm.
it was because everybody on that team had the ability and the willingness to be their authentic self in a safe space. And so it was one of the best teams I ever worked on, and then eventually one of the best teams I ever led because we were being our authentic self.
Love that example. Love that. And I just think about the freedom that an environment like that creates. And there's been so much research about diversity of teams, whether it is ages or um, ethnic identities, whatever it is, that just that diversity, it just brings a different flavor to having all those perspectives on a team. And so I just can imagine that that environment would be really cool to work, a cool environment to work in. So I want you to leave us with the woman who is watching this and they're like, I hear you, April. I want to embrace self-love. I have a new perspective of it from what you've shared, but I still struggle with it. And I still struggle in seeing the value of how it's going to help me as a leader. What would you say to this woman? What encouragement or tips would you have for her?
So, the first thing I would say, and I said this earlier, give yourself some grace.
Mhm.
When we start to learn about, try to embrace a new concept, methodology, whatever you want to call it, a
Mhm.
lot of times we cast aside the self compassion of, I'm going to take my time and ease into this. And sometimes we think I just got to jump head first. And if
Mhm.
I'm not jumping head first and doing it, I'm doing it wrong. So give yourself some grace. Um, Start slow. It takes time to shift your thinking. It takes time to shift your priorities, right? I think about things like this, like a cruise ship, right? A cruise ship doesn't turn on a dime. I mean, the Titanic taught us that, right?
Mhm.
It takes time. And so start small. Take the time to ask yourself, number one, now that I've heard about self love and I've heard some definitions and things like that, what does it mean to me? Get an understanding of why it's important to you, because this is a personal journey. Each of our journeys are different, whether that's self love, self compassion, self talk, self care, right? All of these are a personal journey. So start slow. Ask yourself, what is self love to me? And then take your time to kind of dive into what does that look like. So I talked about things like self talk. That may resonate with you right away, like, oh man, that makes sense. I talked about self compassion. I talked about setting boundaries, personal growth. These are all things that you can start right away in small increments and then just let it grow. But the biggest thing that I would say is let your journey be personal to you.
Mhm. Mhm.
One of the things that I developed earlier this year was a self love journey. I initially developed it for the month of February because the month of February is love, right? But society really paints the love month as relational, right? So whether you're in a relationship or not, but I felt like we didn't talk enough about the relationship with ourselves during our time. And
Mhm.
so it started out really as kind of a resource for a small group. And then I put it out there, and I've had so many women say, I did not know I needed this. I've had women who said, you've made my self love journey easy. Because once again, we can get bogged down with, I want to do this, but I don't know how, I don't know where to start. And it's literally just taking a few minutes each day that you may do things like write a love letter to your body, thanking it for what it does for you. Sitting in your garden, just thinking about your accomplishments. And so take the time to ease into your journey at whatever pace works for you and make it personal.
Yes. So start slow. What does it look like for me? Let it grow and let your journey be personal. So I thank you for that. And if they want to access the self-love guide, they would go to
Yeah, so you guys can connect with me at aprilnowlin.com. There is a resource page. So there's a few other things out there for you, but that self-love guide, it is a no-cost resource. So download that, start there. All my social media handles are April Nowlin. I talk about different things like self-love and healing after heartbreak. So connect with me with on any platform that you're comfortable with.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being my guest today. And I think that this leading with heart is what the title of this session is all about. And I think that you have given us so much practical tools and information that we can use so that we can lead with heart, so that we can prioritize self-care, soul care, self-love for ourselves. And I think you've just given us a really powerful perspective, and I appreciate you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Kendra.